modern-looking skeleton discovered by German scientist Hans Reck in Olduvai Gorge, Tanzania, in 1913 was controversially claimed to date to 1.15 to 1.7 million years ago. This made it the oldest anatomically modern human skeleton ever discovered. Later carbon dating by Rainer Probst, a professor at Frankfurt University, found the fossil to be much younger. However, Probst was subsequently dismissed from the university, and some researchers dispute his findings, upholding the original dating. Over 30 miles long and about 300 feet deep, Olduvai Gorge is an ancient site in the Great Rift Valley in the eastern Serengeti Plain, northern Tanzania. Deposits exposed in the sides of the gorge cover a vast period, beginning around 2.1 million years ago and ending about 15,000 years ago. The deposits have produced the fossil remains of more than 60 human ancestors, thus providing the most continuous known record of human evolution over the past 2 million years. The site has yielded abundant animal fossils and stone artifacts preserved in the well-dated stratigraphic sequence. Olduvai Gorge was made famous by paleoanthropologists Louis and Mary Leakey, who conducted numerous digs at the site in the mid-20th century. The couple's fossil discoveries at the site prove that human beings were far older than had been previously believed, and that human evolution was centered in Africa rather than in Asia, as earlier research had suggested. Long before the Leakeys, Olduvai first became known to the scientific world in 1911, when a German entomologist, Professor Kat Winkel, who was collecting butterflies in the area, discovered the gorge accidentally. He came upon various fossils in the gorge, including teeth of Hipparion, and took them back to Berlin, where they stimulated a great deal of interest. He gave the site the name Olduvai, later to be changed by the English to Olduvai. The finds were believed so significant that a German expedition on behalf of the universities of Berlin and Munich, and under the leadership of geologist and paleontologist Professor Hans Reck, was sent to Tanzania in 1913 and spent 3 months at Olduvai. The most spectacular find from these 1913 excavations was a modern-looking skeleton found embedded in rock on an east-facing slope of Olduvai Gorge. Reck claimed this skeleton was about 500,000 years old, the age of the deposits in which it had been discovered. This was the first discovery of prehistoric human remains in the gorge, which was to become the scene of major discoveries in later years. With Reck's training as a paleontologist, he was used to working with fossils. The fact that the bones he discovered were in a highly compacted deposit persuaded him that they were of great antiquity. In fact, the deposit was so hard that the bones had to be removed with hammers and chisels. This belief in the apparent antiquity of the find was supported by his analysis of the geological sequence in the gorge. The skeleton, which lay in the crouch position, typical of late Stone Age burials he had seen in East Africa and elsewhere, was removed from what he had labeled Bed 2, which he dated to over 150,000 years ago. The skeletal remains discovered by Reck included a complete but damaged skull containing 36 teeth rather than the usual 32. Reck understood this as a primitive and therefore early feature of the skeleton. Fossils of an extinct elephant were also discovered in the sediments below the level of the skeleton, which led Reck to conclude that the deposit was dated to the Middle Pleistocene period, now known as Chibanian, between 770,000 and 126,000 years ago. Reck knew that the discovery of Homo sapiens remains in a deposit of this date would be extremely controversial, so he attempted to establish whether the skeleton could have belonged to a later burial. In the end, he was unable to discover evidence for a dug hole into the layer at a later period that might have been a grave cut. Reck's skeleton, now called Olduvai Man, or the Olduvai human skeleton, soon became notorious throughout the scientific world as its age could not be satisfactorily verified. Reck was unable to return to the site due to the 1914-18 war, which put a stop to any further work at Olduvai, as the gorge was in German East Africa, where fierce fighting took place between the British and German forces. It was partly due to the controversy surrounding Reck's discovery that the young Louis Leakey became fascinated with the Olduvai Gorge. Although initially skeptical of Reck's controversial assertions, when Leakey visited the site with Reck, he was soon persuaded to agree with him. The pair then co-authored a letter to the British journal Nature, reporting the new evidence which apparently supported Reck's original theory. As late as 1931, reports were circulating that it was almost beyond question that the skeleton of a human being found by Reck in 1913 was the oldest known authentic skeleton of Homo sapiens. However, from the very beginning there were many academics who disagreed with Reck's dating of the skeleton. Their main objection was that his work was undertaken at Olduvai without any understanding of archaeological stratigraphy. In 1932, English geologist P.G.H. Boswell carried out heavy mineral analysis of Bed 2 and of the deposit near the skeleton and came to the conclusion that the skeleton was a burial and intrusive to Bed 2. Although the deposit in which the skeletal remains were discovered was indeed of Middle Pleistocene date, geological analysis of the material surrounding the skeleton showed it to contain red pebbles and limestone chips. Such material is not found in Bed 2, but occurs higher up in the sequence, which indicates that it is later than that. This would make it certain that the skeleton was intrusive in that layer. In other words, the skeleton lay in a grave cut down from a higher layer. Eventually, Reck himself came to accept the explanation. The case for a much more modern date for the Olduvai man's skeleton appeared to be closed when, in the 1970s, radiocarbon dating of the remains showed them to be no older than 19,000 BC. This apparently proved that the remains belonged to a post-Ice Age man of the Capstone culture and that they had become embedded in layers dating from the early Pleistocene. The radiocarbon dates were apparently obtained by German anthropologist Professor Rainer Proch von Zieten of the University of Frankfurt. Unfortunately, in February 2005, it was revealed that the 30-year-long career of this distinguished academic had come to an abrupt end due to the fact that he had been systematically falsifying the dates on numerous Stone Age relics. Thomas Terberger, the archaeologist who discovered the fraud, said, "Anthropology is going to have to completely revise its picture of modern man between 40,000 and 10,000 years ago. Professor Proch's work appeared to prove that anatomically, modern humans and Neanderthals had coexisted and perhaps even had children together. This now appears to be rubbish." The academic scandal was only discovered when the professor was caught trying to sell his department's entire chimpanzee skull collection in the United States. Further inquiries later established that he had also authorized fake fossils as real and had plagiarized other scientists' work. An important Hamburg skull fragment, which was believed to have come from the world's oldest German, a Neanderthal, was actually only 7,500 years old, according to Oxford University's radiocarbon dating unit. The unit also established that other skulls dated by Professor Rainer Proch von Zieten had been wrongly dated. Some of the professor's other hoaxes were more extreme. One of his more sensational finds, Binshoff's Speyer woman, was dated by him to 21,300 years ago, but in fact lived in 1300 BC, while Paderborn's Sandyman, dated by the professor to an incredible 27,600 BC, only died a couple of hundred years ago in 1750. Professor Ulrich Brandt, who led the investigation into the nefarious activities, said, "It's deeply embarrassing. Of course the university feels very bad about this. The professor refused to meet us, but we had 10 sittings with 12 witnesses. Their stories about him were increasingly bizarre. After a while, it was hard to take it seriously. You had to laugh, it was just unbelievable. At the end of the day, what he did was incredible." Investigators also discovered that some of the 12,000 skeletons stored in the university department's bone cellar were missing their heads, apparently sold by the professor to friends in the US and various dentists. The professor, who lived in Mainz with his wife Angelina, refused to answer questions by reporters, merely saying that he was the victim of an intrigue and that all the disputed fossils are my personal property. So where does this leave Olduvai man? The radiocarbon dating by the remains by Professor Proch cannot be taken seriously. Until full proof of radiocarbon dating is performed on the skeleton, Reck's original hypotheses that he had discovered the remains of the oldest known skeleton of Homo sapiens cannot be dismissed out of hand. A skeleton dubbed Littlefoot, discovered in South Africa in the 1990s, is claimed to be the most complete ancient hominin in the fossil record. The results of recent analysis into the skeleton have caused controversy, as researchers claim that Littlefoot actually lived some 3.67 million years ago, about a million years earlier than previous claims, and that the fossil probably represents a previously unknown species related to humans. In 1994, Ronald Clark, a paleoanthropologist at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, was examining boxes of fossils at a field laboratory at the Sterfontein Caves, about 25 miles northwest of Johannesburg. The collection had previously been thought to contain nothing but ancient monkey bones. When he came upon a group of small bones in the collection, he immediately realized that they belonged to an early hominin. Clark later established that the bones seemed to have belonged to an ancient species of ape-like hominins that were present in Africa between about 4 million and 2 million years ago, before the human genus Homo became dominant. In 1997, Clark came upon more bones from the skeleton at a nearby medical school and decided he would search for more of the Littlefoot skeleton in the cave itself. But it was to take until 2012 to locate and remove all traces of Littlefoot from the cave. Study researcher Robin Crompton, a musculoskeletal biologist at the University of Liverpool in the United Kingdom, said that the excavations proved much more difficult than at first thought. This was mainly because the bones themselves were softer than the rock surrounding them. Once in possession of the remains, though, even more difficult work lay ahead. Clark said of the recovery of the skeleton, "We used very small tools like needles to excavate it. That's why it took so long. It was like excavating a fluffy pastry out of concrete." In December 2018, it was finally revealed that after 20 years of excavating in South Africa, researchers had completely recovered and cleaned the most complete skeleton of an approximately 3.67 million-year-old hominin nicknamed Littlefoot. Initial theories were that the Littlefoot fossil is a female who exhibited some of the earliest signs of human-like bipedal walking. Fascinatingly, she may also belong to a distinct species that most researchers haven't previously recognized. The nickname Littlefoot came from the small size of the foot bones that were among the first parts of the skeleton to be discovered. The newly discovered Littlefoot specimen is more than 90% complete, which far exceeds the amount of remains of its more famous cousin Lucy, whose skeleton is about 40% complete. The skeleton's relatively small build and certain skull features suggested to the researchers that it was probably a female of advanced age, with a brain size of about 408 cubic centimeters, about one-third the size of modern human brains. The woman seemed to have suffered a forearm injury early in life, and her comparatively long legs in proportion to her arms means that she had similar proportions to those of modern humans. Littlefoot is the oldest known hominin to have this feature, which suggests that she probably walked upright more than she swung through trees. Researchers stated that Littlefoot was probably 4 foot 3 inches tall and also vegetarian. According to Robin Crompton, "My analysis of her skeleton shows that she and the rest of the local population of her species at that time were under active natural selection for an ability to walk efficiently, fully upright on the ground over medium to long distances." Examination of the skeletal remains showed that Littlefoot had sustained an arm injury early in life. However, this injury had healed long before she fell into the cave where she was found and died. The fatal fall may have been during a struggle with a large monkey, as the skeleton of one was found very close to her, said Crompton. Based in part on the examination of her teeth and hips, researchers believe Littlefoot represents a new species. The name had previously been given to a hominin skull fragment found in South Africa in 1948, but it was withdrawn after researchers decided that the skull probably belonged to an unusual Africanus. However, Lee Berger, an archaeologist at the University of Witwatersrand, who was not involved with the latest research into the skeleton but is working on publications about Littlefoot, stated that if Littlefoot is actually a newly identified species, which he is far from convinced is the case, then she should have a new species name and not reuse an old undefined one. But Crompton disagreed. After the Australopithecus africanus specimen was properly named, Clark began using that name for other bone fragments found in the cave. He said on the naming issue, "It's a bad practice and against the International Code of Zoological Nomenclature to create new names where a valid name already exists, and no good argument for separation into a different species exists." So as Professor Clark did not have evidence that Littlefoot was part of a different species, and he continued to use that name for the fossils in the published scientific literature, it was entirely appropriate that he used the existing and valid name. Berger is also concerned about the lack of solid information in the recently published papers on the Littlefoot skeleton. He believes there should be more detailed measurements of the fossil bones. For instance, there's no data, there are almost no measurements of the fossils, he says. Berger hopes one day to provide the missing data in his own publications, although he is still at an early stage of the analysis. The researchers suggest that these specimens are potentially an ancestor of a group of hominins called the Paranthropus 4, which coexisted with early Homo species for about 1 million years. Much more controversy has arisen over the dating of the Littlefoot fossil. Based on the age of the sediments around the fossil, the researchers have dated Littlefoot to around 3.67 million years ago, about 1 million years earlier than previous dates for the skeleton. This would mean Littlefoot was alive about 500,000 years before Lucy in Ethiopia. The date would mean that our ancient ancestors were almost certainly scattered across Africa. Some researchers are unconvinced that the skeleton itself is as old as the sediments in which it was found. Fred Grein, a paleoanthropologist at Stony Brook, New York, quipped, "We buried a dead squirrel in our backyard in November 2014, but I think the sand surrounds it dates back to the last glacial retreat on Long Island." He argues that millions of years after the sand crystals washed into the cave, a larger opening could have formed, allowing an ancient human ancestor to fall in. Dal Granger, however, is aware of the dating problems. Dating cave sediments and their fossils is difficult. We know so much about the timing of hominid evolution in East Africa because there are many datable volcanic ashes associated with the fossil sites. In places like South Africa, there are no volcanic ashes to date. The cave sediments themselves can be very complicated, with sediment falling into multiple entrances, collapsing into lower sections, and overlapping each other. In March 2020, it was reported in the media that a high-resolution micro-CT scanning of the skull of Littlefoot has revealed some aspects of how this species used to live more than 3 million years ago. The work was undertaken by University of Witwatersrand team, which included lead researcher Dr. Amélie Boudet. By comparing the Littlefoot with other fossils from South and East Africa, as well as living humans and chimpanzees, the team showed that it was capable of head movements that differ from modern humans. In the summary of the paper, the doctor states, "In particular, the nearly complete atlas of Littlefoot has the potential to provide new insights into the evolution of head mobility and the arterial supply to the brain in the human lineage. Our study shows that it was capable of head movements that differ from us. This could be explained by the greater ability of them to climb and move in trees. However, a southern African specimen younger than Littlefoot, probably younger by about 1 million years, may have partially lost this capacity and spent more time on the ground, like us today." One aspect of the new research appears to contradict, to some extent, earlier conclusions about Littlefoot's movement. The new study found that the overall dimensions and shape of the atlas, the topmost bone sitting just below the skull of Littlefoot, are similar to living chimpanzees. More specifically, the ligament insertions and the morphology of the facet joints linking the head and the neck all suggest that Littlefoot was moving regularly in trees rather than mainly on the ground, as was previously believed. A spectacular recent find from Kenya by Meave Leakey of the National Museum of Kenya and her colleagues has caused controversy in the scientific world. The find, a damaged but almost complete skull and face, is claimed to be 3.5 million years old and belong to an entirely new breed of early human. However, many scientists have objected to this identification due to apparent damage to the fossil, and the debate over whether it is indeed a new species is still continuing. Born on the 28th of July 1942 in London, English paleoanthropologist Dr. Meave Leakey is part of a family that has gained worldwide renown for decades of pioneering hominin research in Eastern Africa. She is the daughter-in-law of Lewis and Mary Leakey and wife of Richard Leakey, the famous paleontologists who have made several significant hominid finds in the last 50 years. In 2002, Meave Leakey, along with her daughter Louise, was named an Explorer in Residence by the National Geographic Society. In 2007, Leakey was a lead author of a study in the journal Nature that went against the predominant view of the ancestral lineage of Homo sapiens, namely that the species Homo habilis evolved into Homo erectus in linear succession. Currently, Dr. Leakey is a research professor in the Department of Anthropology, Stony Brook University, New York, Director of Pleistocene Research at the Turkana Basin Institute, Kenya, Explorer in Residence at the National Geographic Society, and co-leader with her daughter Louise of the Kubifora Research Project, the KFRP. In 2001, Meave and her daughter Louise and colleagues reported on the discovery of a 3.5 million-year-old skull that they believed belonged to a previously unknown hominin genus and species, the Kenyan flatface. Research assistant Justus Eris had made the find 2 years earlier while working with members of the Leakey family near the Lomkwi River in northern Kenya. The almost complete skull was battered and weathered, but for the Leakeys, cleverly represented a new breed of early human. It is the oldest near-complete human skull ever found. For the previous 2 decades, scientists had believed that a species better known as Lucy, named after the partial Ethiopian skeleton discovered in 1974, was our single common ancestor. Meave and Louise's discovery apparently demonstrated that humans did not descend from Lucy, and that, rather than a neat ancestral line linking us to chimps, there were likely numerous species of hominids living at the same time. According to Meave, the find was significant because it showed us that the situation was a lot more complex than we thought. Whilst Lucy was able to walk upright, she had an ape-like projecting mouth and heavy brow. The newly discovered skull, the only one of its kind so far identified, however, has a much flatter face and raised cheekbones. The brow is smaller and teeth are intermediate between typical human and typical ape forms, with fairly small molars compared to Lucy and her later relatives. Dr. Leakey said of the huge importance of the find, "This shows persuasively that at least 2 lineages existed as far back as 3.5 million years. The early stages of human evolution are more complex than we previously thought. Kenyan flat-faced man still had a long way to go in terms of brain power, however, possessing a brain cage no bigger than a modern chimp." The new find is said to come from a completely new genus, though this new group may, according to some researchers, already have 2 members. They have noted that the features exhibited look very similar to those of a skull discovered in 1972 on the eastern shore of Lake Turkana in the Kenyan Rift Valley by Meave Leakey's husband Richard. The skull, named 1470 Man, had a very human-like face, flat rather than protruding like an ape, and with small teeth. The age of 1470 Man was controversial for many years. It's believed by most researchers to be around 1.8 million years old and is assigned to the species Homo rudolphinus, usually regarded as a very primitive member of our own lineage. However, a few people believe the skull should not be attributed to Homo rudolphinus and needs to be re-examined. In Leakey's studies of the finds published in 2012, she stated that the specimen from Lake Turkana is a different species from the early Homo varieties previously known to have inhabited the area. These were Homo habilis, handyman, the assumed tool user, conventionally seen as the earliest known Homo species, and Homo erectus, the upright man, thought to be a direct ancestor of our own species. According to Leakey, with these new fossils we can definitely say there are two groups of non-erectus living side by side at Lake Turkana, as opposed to other species of Homo which had rather protruding faces. What would have struck you was how flat and broad the face was. Their brain case is beginning to get a little bit of a forehead because it's quite a big brain in there, but nothing like the brain of Homo erectus, which likely arose later. The study team wanted to avoid the previously proposed names for the flat-faced species Homo rudolphinus, as the relationships between the fossil specimens and the species names is still uncertain. The study team wanted to avoid the previously proposed name for the flat-faced species Homo rudolphinus, as the relationships between the fossil specimens and the species names is still uncertain. One fascinating question is how the three early humans would have coexisted without friction over food supplies, for example, existing between them. According to physical anthropologist William Kimball, given the facts that they were all terrestrial bipeds of one sort or another, differences in how the three species made a living and where they chose to live would have come down to diet, as opposed to, say, climbing ability. Perhaps it may just be that these early human species simply had no problems getting along with each other. Modern primates are generally very good at living together, Leakey commented. You can see troops of monkeys composed of at least two species, if not more. The study of the origins of man is understandably a controversial and complex area. Since Meave Leakey's initial discovery, the picture has been complicated even more by the identification in 2000 of a hominin now called Oronin tugenensis. This creature could represent an entirely new group of hominids and is claimed to be the oldest human-like creature known to science, taking our lineage back to an astonishing 6 million years ago. In 2000, the research team of Bridget Sennett and Martin Pickford discovered fossil material consisting of a partial humerus, femur and mandible, a distant thumb bone and some teeth in the Tugen Hills of Kenya. The molars were covered with thick enamel like those of later hominins and were small like our own. The discovery was nicknamed at the time Millennium Man due to its discovery date and was dated to 6 million years ago and given the taxonomic classification Ororin tugenensis, original man from the Tugen Hills. Initially, paleoanthropologists were skeptical of the find, with many remaining so to this day, especially as the fossils were not made available to the scientific community. Although there is still a heated debate over the fossil, it is increasingly presented in published texts as hominin. Millennium Man lived around the time when genetic analysis suggests our oldest hominin ancestor split from the oldest ancestor of the great apes. This means there's a chance that Ororin tugenensis could be the fabled missing link, or at least one of them. In March 2003, paleontologist Tim White of the University of California, Berkeley, questioned the heritage of Meave Leakey's find. He argued that it was more likely to be a Kenyan variant of Lucy. White based his assertion on the fact that the cranium was cracked and distorted when discovered, making it possible that some of its apparently unique features, including its flat face and tall vertically oriented cheekbones, could have been caused by geological processes. Fred Spoor of the University College London, who was part of the team that found the Kenyan flat-faced man fossil, disputed such objections and made a new, detailed study of the skull. From examining computed tomography scans, Spoor concluded that the upper jaw had suffered much less distortion than the rest of the cranium. So he focused his studies on that bone, correcting for the distortion present, and concluded that Leakey and her colleagues had been correct in designating the fossil a new species. Ancient hominin bones discovered in northern Spain's Atapuerca Mountains have pushed back the arrival of humans in Europe to roughly 1.2 million years ago, around 500,000 years earlier than once believed. Fascinatingly, only about 1/10 of the site's total area has been excavated, which means there may be many more important discoveries in store. One mystery of the site the archaeologists have so far been unable to solve is how the remains of 32 individuals accumulated at the bottom of a narrow cave shaft at the site. The discovery of Atapuerca. Atapuerca is the site of a number of limestone caves near Burgos in northern Spain, known for the abundant fossil record of the earliest human beings in Europe dating back almost 1 million years. The sites at Atapuerca have been known since the end of the 19th century, but it was not until the 1950s that any details of the site became known when the Edelweiss Caving Club, ECC of Burgos, northern Spain, began to catalogue and map Cueva Maya at Atapuerca. In 1962, ECC members reported fossils in the railway cutting to the local authorities. A decade later, the ECC discovered the Gallery of Flint, and in 1976 they located hominid skulls in the Pit of Bones. Paleontologist Emiliano Aguirre began investigating sites at Atapuerca soon afterwards, and in 1978 put together a research project for the first excavations there, which he led until 1991 when he retired and handed over the leadership of the Atapuerca research project. In March 2008, it was announced that Spanish paleontologists had unearthed the remains of a 1.2 million-year-old human-like inhabitant of Western Europe in the caves at Atapuerca. According to the researcher, the fossil find demonstrates that members of our genus, Homo, colonized this region far earlier than previously believed. The primitive hominin is represented by a fragment of jawbone bearing a few teeth. Although stone tools of a similar age to the fossil jawbone, from about 1.2 to 1.5 million years old, had previously been discovered in France, Italy and Spain, this is the first verifiable human material of this date. This lends support to the theory that the tools found in the vicinity were made by primitive humans. According to Chris Stringer of the Natural History Museum in London, when combined with the emerging archaeological evidence, it suggests that southern Europe began to be colonized from Western Asia not long after humans had emerged from Africa, something which many of us would have doubted even 5 years ago. One of the sites at Atapuerca, Grandalina, contains human remains which have been dated to about 800,000 years ago, as well as some of the earliest tools ever found in Western Europe. But perhaps the most fascinating discovery at Atapuerca was a cave called the Pit of Bones, where 43 feet down, more than 1,600 human fossils, including several nearly complete skulls, were found. The materials in the pit dates back to between 600,000 and 300,000 years and represents about 28 individuals whose brain sizes are within the range of both Neanderthals and modern humans. This represents the world's largest collection in any one place of ancient human fossils. Compared to modern humans, these people were short, stocky, and had smaller brains. It has been estimated males were about 5'7" tall and weighed around 170 pounds, whereas females stood around 5'2" and weighed 125 pounds. The skeletons exhibit a number of characteristics unique to Neanderthals, including a projecting midface, long and narrow pubic bones, and thick finger bones. However, unlike later Neanderthals, they do not fully express the characteristic Neanderthal form. The site also contained a 430,000-year-old fractured skull, which has been interpreted as the earliest evidence of interpersonal violence in Homo. Also discovered in the pit were the bones of cave bears. It's believed that the bears fell down the shaft by accident, probably while seeking places to hibernate. But what the human bones were doing there can only be imagined. No signs of tool butchery or other food remains were discovered, and a single stone hand axe was the only tool discovered in the pit, fashioned from a type of stone not known in the area. Researchers have proposed various hypotheses to explain how the fossils got there. According to one theory, the bodies may have been purposely dropped by their relatives in some kind of ritual burial. This would push back the origin of mortuary practices in humans substantially. Thus far, the earliest accepted burials only occur after 130,000 years ago among Neanderthals and Homo sapiens. However, other researchers believe it is more than likely that the bodies were deliberately dropped there after meeting violent ends. The hominins may also have been dragged there by carnivores, carried by floodwaters, or even been trapped after venturing too far. In August 2016, a study of the human remains from the pit of bones was published in the Journal of Archaeological Science. It identified trauma on 8 skulls from the pit. Part of the abstract of the study reads, "The fractures found in 17 crania from SH display a post-mortem fracturation pattern, which occurred in the dry bone stage and is compatible with collective burial assemblages. Nevertheless, in addition to the post-mortem fractures, 8 crania also display some typical peri-mortem traumas. Interpersonal violence as a cause for the peri-mortem fractures can be confirmed for one of the skulls, cranium 17, and also probable for cranium 5 and cranium 11. For the rest of the crania, although other causes cannot be absolutely ruled out, the violence-related traumas are the most plausible scenario for the peri-mortem fractures. If this hypothesis is confirmed, we could interpret that interpersonal violence was a recurrent behavior in this population from the Middle Pleistocene. It would appear from the results of this study that at least some of those in the pit suffered a violent end at the hands of other members of the population in the area. However, this still doesn't explain how and why the dead bodies were taken into the cave chamber. Perhaps the perpetrators wanted to hide their victims, or maybe relatives interred the corpses in the pit. We shall probably never know for sure. In December 2013, it was revealed that a thigh bone from the pit of bones had yielded 400,000-year-old DNA, by far the oldest human DNA ever sequenced. Previously, the oldest human DNA sequenced came from bones that were less than 120,000 years old. Astonishingly, the results suggested that the thigh bone belonged to a previously unknown human species, which some researchers believe may even be a missing link between Neanderthals and their mysterious cousins, the Denisovans. Paleontologists believe this result brings us nearer than ever before to understanding who our own common ancestor with the Neanderthals was. According to Chris Stringer, the genomes we have up until now are really very recent. This takes us at least a few 100,000 years back towards our common ancestor with other hominins. The researchers had expected the DNA to resemble Neanderthal, but it proved to be quite distinct, most closely resembling that of the mysterious Denisovans, a species known only from a finger bone and 2 teeth discovered in a Siberian cave. Stringer admitted that they were somewhat baffled by this result, as there is no evidence that the Denisovans ranged anywhere near Atapuerca. One possibility considered by the researchers is that the fossils belong to the common ancestor of Neanderthals and Denisovans, and some of their descendants later traveled east and became the Denisovans. The genome recovered from the pit of bones is particularly relevant, as it is from a period that is extremely close to the origin of our human line. The archaeological evidence indicates that these early humans were developing important new ways of behaving, though they were still using fairly primitive stone tools like the crafted hand axe, which researchers have nicknamed Excalibur, that was found in the pit. But the bones also suggest more sophisticated traits. One of these traits is the use of the pit as an early burial site, part of a very simple funeral rite. Chris Stringer has even suggested that Excalibur may have been some kind of tribute to the dead. The discovery in the pit of the deformed skull of a girl, who lived to be about 12 years old, also reiterates this more modern behavior, suggesting that the tribe cared for her. There's a hint of something human caring for the disabled, says Stringer. In March 2016, a paper was published in the journal Nature, describing a DNA study which, to the surprise of many, identified the remains of the pit bones as Neanderthal. Using this information, the researchers were able to push back the date when the separation between our family branch and that of Neanderthals to sometime between 550,000 and almost 800,000 years ago. In 2019, a comparative study was published of the dental evolution of a number of human species, including the Neanderthals of the pit of bones. These results revealed that the divergence between modern humans and Neanderthals must have occurred at least 800,000 years ago.
A woman's skull, the oldest known human remains ever found in Antarctica, discovered lying on Yamaha Beach at Cape Sheriff in Antarctica's South Shetland Islands, has become one of the continent's biggest mysteries. No surviving documents have ever been discovered to explain how or why a young woman came to be in Antarctica during this era. But now, new evidence may have finally been found to solve the case. Antarctica is about 5.5 million square miles in size, and thick ice covers about 98% of the land. The continental ice sheet contains about 7 million cubic miles of ice, making up about 90% of the world's ice and 80% of its fresh water. Although Antarctica has a fascinating history of human activity in the region, it extends back only about 200 years. Indeed, the majority of what is known about Antarctica has been discovered in the last few decades. Remote, inaccessible, and hostile, Antarctica was the last continent to be discovered, and acknowledged if the South Polar region was collected slowly. The real nature of Antarctica was shown for the first time as long as the 18th century by the second voyage of the English navigator, Captain James Cook. Mariners who followed Cook into high southern latitudes of the icy continent did so because of his reports of huge numbers of whales and seals. On the 16th and 17th of November, 1820, American seal hunter Nathaniel Brown Palmer, then 21 years old, commanded the 47-foot-long sloop Hero, which entered the Orleans Strait and came very close to the Antarctic Peninsula. Palmer and his men became the first Americans and the third group of people to discover the Antarctic Peninsula. While there, Palmer met Russian captain Thaddeus Bellingshausen on a major national expedition that circumnavigated Antarctica eastward. The highly controversial question of who was first to sight land in Antarctica has never been resolved. British, Russian, and US ships were all present in the Antarctic Peninsula area in the early 1820s when the first sightings occurred. However, the first documented landing of the continent was not until decades later, on January 24, 1895, when the Norwegian whaling ship Antarctic landed a party at Cape Adare on the northern Ross Sea. From the late 18th to the mid-20th century, whalers and sealers operated in the rich seas surrounding the continent. From the mid-20th century onwards, scientific investigation replaced whaling and sealing as the primary year-round human activity in Antarctica. These days, around 1,200 people spend the winter in Antarctica. All of these are scientists and their support staff. Yamana Beach is an ice-free beach located on the west coast of Cape Sheriff in the north extremity of the Ioannis Paulus II Peninsula, Livingston Island in the South Shetlands of Antarctica. Sometime in 1985, human remains were discovered by chance the remote Antarctic beach by Chilean biologist Dr. Daniel Torres. According to Torres, on the afternoon of January 7, 1985, I was doing a census of mammals and also collecting marine refuse on Cape Sheriff, Livingston Island. On the beach, I saw a big plastic container and an enormous plastic orange buoy. I went to the buoy first to collect it, and as I headed along the beach, I noticed that among the very dark volcanic stones, there was one very white stone, but when I got closer, I saw that on the surface of the stone there was a series of lines that looked like a human skull. Obviously, I stopped and went up closer, and I was able to establish that it was a human cranium, half buried in this very thick volcanic sand, 40 meters away from the shore. I started very slowly separating the pebbles until I could pull out the top part of the cranium, and as the upper jaw bones were missing, I was looking for the other remains until I found them. Subsequent analysis of the skull at the Chilean Antarctic Institute revealed that it belongs to a young woman of 21, at the most. But who was she, and what was she doing in this remote spot? In January 1987, part of a human femur was found inland from Yamana Beach, and in January 1991, another part of a femur was found close proximity to the site of the earlier 1987 find. It was later revealed that the remains were of an indigenous female from southern Chile, who is believed to have died between 1819 and 1825. This makes the woman's bones the oldest known human remains ever found in Antarctica. But how did she get there? The traditional canoes of the indigenous Chileans could not possibly have managed such a long voyage through extremely rough seas. Fascinatingly, the girls' dates match up with the first known landings on Antarctica, though the location of the discovery was unusual, at a beach camp made by sealers. Female sealers were absolutely unheard of at the time. One theory is that the girl was an indigenous guide, translator, or navigator to the sealers traveling from the northern hemisphere to the Antarctic islands. But women taking part in such expeditions to the far south in the early 19th century was unlikely, though not impossible. Another much darker theory is that the girl was taken by force from her home in what is now southern Chile by sealers, and abandoned in the area where her remains were found 175 years later. Perhaps we will never know. There are no surviving documents explaining how or why this young Chilean woman came to be in Antarctica at this time. Her bones marked the start of human activity on Antarctica and were a hugely significant discovery for archaeology. But they are also of vital importance to the history of Antarctica as a whole, as they could be proof that Chile, which lies about 620 miles away from Antarctica, made the first known landings on Antarctica. It must be added that this is disputed in some quarters. Some researchers believe that in 1819, officers, soldiers, and seamen of the storm-damaged Spanish ship San Telmo, the flagship of a Spanish naval squadron bound for Peru, may have been the first people to land on Antarctica. If any crew members survived the initial sinking of the San Telmo north of Livingston Island and managed to get to Antarctica, they would have been the first humans in history to reach the continent. Indeed, some remnants and signs of wreckage were later said to have been found on Livingston Island in the South Shetland Islands by the English Captain William Smith, on board of Brig Williams, who arrived at the island of Livingston in October of the same year. The Antarctic Treaty System was first signed in 1959, but in 1998, a protocol on environmental protection was added stating that Antarctica is to be a natural reserve devoted to peace and science, and forbids all activity relating to the Antarctic mineral resources, except as is necessary for scientific research. But significantly, this is the part of the treaty that could come under some review in 2048, 50 years after it was signed. On that date, the prohibition on mining resource extraction could be changed or scrapped completely. According to Klaus Dodds, professor of geopolitics at Royal Holloway University of London, there is a huge political storm coming connected with Antarctica. Lots of people just don't understand that there's a darker side to Antarctica. What we're seeing is great power politics play out in a space that a lot of people think of as just frozen wastes. The reason 2048 looms large is because if certain countries feel that the prohibition on mineral exploitation is no longer to be respected, people worry that the whole thing could unravel. 7 nations laid overlapping claims on Antarctic land when the treaty was adopted: Argentina, Australia, Chile, France, New Zealand, Norway, and the UK. The treaty holds all these claims in place and prohibited any new ones from being established. The treaty also puts any expansions to territorial claims to Antarctica on hold, but the big players, usually China and Russia, are thinking about this particular episode around 2048 and planning ahead. Of course, when human remains like the Chilean girl or objects are found in the ice, it ignites feelings of territorial naturalism. If Chile could use these remains to demonstrate that it had people living in Antarctica earlier than other nations making land claims, well, then they would be in a much stronger position in negotiations. A number of countries are now subtly trying to help their claims in Antarctica in differing ways, such as financing scientific research, historical investigation, and constructing research bases around the continent. It looks like the future of this remote icy continent may be more complicated and controversial than anyone could have ever imagined.
Randy Hass, an anthropologist from the University of California, was working with his colleagues at a high-altitude site in the area known as Willamaya Pajaxta in southern Peru, when they found 6 burials dating back almost 9,000 years, which contained the remains of 6 individuals. During their work, the team collaborated with the local Amara community. Teenage female huntress buried with her tools. One burial pit was not like the others. Based on the hunting toolkit found with the deceased, The team initially thought that the burial was of a male hunter. However, the bones were very slender, light, and appeared to be those of a female. Science quotes one of the team members, bioarchaeologist Jim Watson, as saying, "I think your hunter might be female." Indeed, the grave contained the remains of a young woman who died between the ages of 17 and 19. Her gender and age were determined based on an analysis of proteins in her teeth. Anthropologist Randy Hass has told Sky News that the female hunter had been buried with stone projectile points for felling large animals, a knife and flakes of rock for removing internal organs, and tools for scraping and tanning hides. The stone points would have been attached to shafts and used as spear throwers and hurled at animals with great force. A pigment chunk was also found with her, which was used in the treatment of hides. Was the discovery an outlier? The female hunter was found near the grave of a male who was also buried with a hunting toolkit. The team of researchers also found evidence of animal bones in the sediment of the burial ground, including Andean deer and visuna. Hass told Science News that these two animals were the main targets of ancient hunters in that part of the Andes. However, many believe that the find was a one-off and that the female big game hunter was an outlier. Science quotes Meg Conkey, an archaeologist who didn't take part in the study, as stating that skeptics may say it's a one-off. Moreover, the presence of hunting gear in a grave does not necessarily mean that the deceased was a hunter. Haas and his team set out to prove that there had once been other female hunters in the Americas. Haas and his colleagues were prepared for this and conducted an exhaustive study of the research literature on 107 burial sites in the Americas. All of these sites are between 6,000 and 12,500 years old. In total, the researchers found 10 women who had been buried with hunting toolkits. Their research has led them to conclude that women routinely participated in big game hunts. The researchers wrote in Science Advances that the findings are consistent with non-gendered label practices in which early hunter-gatherer females were big game hunters. Based on their study of other sites, the research team believes that females accounted for between 30 and 50% of ancient American big game hunters, reports Science News. They're convinced that the evidence is strong for their theory. The researchers also consider that archaeologists did not recognize that females were big game hunters in the past because of sexism. Gizmodo quotes the researchers as saying that modern gender constructs often do not reflect past ones. In other words, just because women in the recent past were not big game hunters, this does not mean that there weren't any female big game hunters in the Americas 9,000 years ago. Up until recently, the man-the-hunter hypothesis was widely accepted according to science. This held that women did women's work and that males engaged in activities such as hunting and as a result were the dominant gender. This was based in part on modern studies of hunter-gatherer groups such as the Hasda of Tasmania. Inspired by their groundbreaking discovery in Peru, the researchers argue that this was not the case. Big game hunting would have required teamwork, a group of people working together and a great deal of labor. Therefore, women would have had to have cooperated with men to ensure success in hunting expeditions. Quoted in Gizmodo, the researchers argue that there was a broad participation from both females and males in the hunting of big game. Ashley Smallwood of the University of Louisville in Kentucky tells Science News that it's time to stop thinking of ancient female large-game hunters as outliers. The discovery of the ancient female huntress in Peru could transform our knowledge of gender roles in the past. If women hunted, this would imply that there was more equality between the genders in prehistoric societies. However, some have argued against these findings and state that the researchers cannot prove their arguments about female hunters because the sample that they investigated is simply too small. However, the research is aligned with recent discoveries that challenge the traditional assumptions about gender roles in prehistory. Archaeologists have found evidence of a 5,000-year-old female warrior in California, while other finds suggest that there were female fighters in both Mongolian and Viking societies in the distant past. A team of Spanish researchers theorizes, based on grooves and nicks on the teeth of Neanderthals, that gender roles among that species were similar to gender roles of modern Homo sapiens. Neanderthal men prepared the cutting tools and weapons, while women saw to the leather garments and clothing. But there was at least one duty that men and women may have shared. Neanderthal women, these researchers think, hunted big game with the men. Almudena Estalrich, a researcher at the Spanish National Museum of Natural Sciences, said, "We believe that the specialization of labor by sex of the individuals was probably limited to a few tasks, as it is possible that both men and women participated equally in the hunting of big animals." Another researcher on the project, Antonio Rosas, along with the museum, told phys.org, "The study of Neanderthals has provided numerous discoveries in recent years. We have moved from thinking of them as little evolved beings to know that they took care of the sick people, buried their deceased, ate seafood, and even had different physical features than expected. There were red-headed individuals and with light skin and eyes. So far, we thought that the sexual division of labor was typical of sapient societies, but apparently that's not true." A study of ancient DNA by other researchers showed a mutation that may have resulted in red hair and light skin among Neanderthals, according to the Smithsonian Museum of Natural History. An article on the Smithsonian's website says 2 Neanderthals, one from Spain and one from Italy, had a mutation in a gene controlling skin and hair color. The mutation changes an amino acid, making the resulting protein less efficient. Modern humans have other MCR1 variants that are also less active, resulting in red hair and pale skin. The less active Neanderthal mutation probably also resulted in red hair and pale skin, as in modern humans. Phys.org says that one of the main conclusions of a study of 99 incisors and canines of 19 Neanderthal people showed that their communities divided work according to sex. The study, by the Spanish National Research Council, was published in the Journal of Human Evolution. The Neanderthals' teeth came from sites at El Sidron, Asturias, Spain, Spy, Belgium, and Lourdes, France. The study said grooves in the teeth of women appeared to follow the same pattern. The pattern of the grooves in women's teeth differed from that in men's. Analysis shows that all Neanderthals, regardless of age, had grooves in their teeth. This is due to the custom of these societies to use the mouth as a third hand, as in some current populations, for tasks such as preparing the furs for chopping meat, for instance. The researchers found that the grooves in men's teeth were longer than women's and made the assumption from this that the tasks the two sexes performed differed. Also, they found tiny nicks in the enamel and dentin of the upper teeth of men and in the lower teeth of women. Researchers are unable to make rock-solid conclusions about which tasks men performed and which tasks women performed, but they said in modern hunter-gatherer society, women typically prepare furs and other garments, and men retouch the edges of stone tools. They say this may have been how it was among the Neanderthals they studied.